There is a memo in the BBC archives, unearthed from a dusty cabinet in 2009, that rewrites the liberation of Paris. It is dated January 1944, stamped confidential, and signed by Major General Walter Bedell Smith, Chief of Staff to Dwight D. Eisenhower. The language is bureaucratic, bloodless, and absolute. It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel. That sentence, written 1,200 miles from the nearest battlefield, decided who would march down the Champs-Élysées and who would be loaded onto trucks in the dark. The official story tells us that France liberated itself, that de Gaulle led a triumphant French division into Paris, that the crowd wept and waved flags as the heroes of the Republic reclaimed their capital, that the liberation was a pure moment of national resurrection. But this memo, and the thousands of orders that followed it, proved that the accepted narrative is incomplete. The liberation of Paris was not a military operation, it was a casting call, and the men who had done the fighting were told they had the wrong face for the victory. The threat is not that we forgot them, the threat is that we replaced them, that we looked at the same photograph for 80 years and never noticed who was missing. Why did the Allies need Paris to be liberated by white hands only? How did 2/3 of an army simply vanish from the frame? Drop into August 25th, 1944. The 2nd Armored Division enters Paris from the south, the crowd surges, the bells ring. And somewhere in the chaos, a 22-year-old resistance fighter from Gabon named Georges Duxon is walking inches from Charles de Gaulle, his arm in a sling from a German bullet, his face beaming with the joy of a liberated city. He has earned his place there. He has disabled German trucks, he has captured a tank, he has killed for this moment. But the photographer's flash has barely faded before an officer accosts him. A gun is drawn. Duxon is marched away from the parade at gunpoint. Who held the pen that erased him? It was not one man. It was a machinery of racial choreography. Eisenhower's chief of staff wrote the memo in January. De Gaulle's staff executed the orders in August. And the cameras, carefully positioned along the Champs-Élysées, captured only the faces that fit the myth. What did they gain? They gained a photograph of white liberation. They gained a narrative that France had freed itself. They gained the silence of 130,000 colonial soldiers who were ordered to surrender their weapons, their uniforms, and their place in history. This is not a history lesson. This is a crime scene. The bodies were not buried. They were cropped out of the image. Before we leave this chapter, I'm going to show you the exact memo that proves the whitening was formal, funded, and approved at the highest levels. It is the Bedell-Smith memo of January 1944. We will decode it together in the investigative core of this video. Do not forget that name. To understand how this erasure was profitable, you must understand the racial economy of the Allied coalition. In 1944, the French Liberation Army was not a white force. It was an imperial force. Of the 250,000 men who made up General de Lattre de Tassigny's First Army, the majority were colonial troops, 130,000 from Algeria and Morocco, 12,000 from Senegal and West Africa, thousands more from Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Indochina. These men had landed in Provence on August 15th. They had liberated Marseille, Toulon, and Lyon. They had bled in the Vosges and frozen in the Alps. They had carried the tricolor into cities that the white resistance had not yet reached. But by September, the orders began to change. The French General Staff began referring in writing to the rapid transformation of Senegalese troops into all-white units. The mechanism was not mysterious. It was a payroll decision, a logistics decision, a public relations decision. White resistance fighters from the French forces of the interior, many of them barely trained, were given the uniforms and weapons stripped from colonial veterans. Spanish Republican exiles who had fled Franco's regime were rushed into the ranks to fill the gaps. North African soldiers who were considered light enough were kept. The rest were sent south. The transaction was not moral. It was mechanical. It was a ledger entry. France needed a white liberation, and the United States was willing to pay for it with silence. Because the American army was still segregated. Black American GIs fought in separate units, drove supply trucks, loaded ammunition, and were forbidden from combat alongside white soldiers. The idea that African troops might liberate a European capital, might be embraced by white civilians, might be photographed as heroes, was seen as a direct threat to Jim Crow. So Bedell-Smith wrote his memo. And France, desperate for Allied recognition and post-war legitimacy, complied. The cost was borne by the men who had already paid it in blood. But ledgers do not bleed, people do. So let us zoom from institution to individual. Georges Duxon was not a soldier when the war began. He was a young man from Gabon who had enlisted in the French army in 1940, gone underground during the occupation, and joined the resistance in the northwestern districts of Paris. When the insurrection broke out on August 19th, he commanded a cell that disabled German trucks and captured an enemy tank. He was promoted to second lieutenant on the spot. He was wounded in the arm and on August 26th, he walked beside de Gaulle, not as an intruder, but as a liberator. For a few minutes, the cameras caught him. You can still find the photographs. Doksun, tall and reedy, his arm in a sling, walking inches from the general. Doksun, laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Doksun, for one impossible moment, visible. But the photographer's flash has barely faded before an officer accosts him. A gun is drawn. Doksun is marched away from the parade at gunpoint. He tried to survive in a city that no longer needed him. He ran a black market operation from an abandoned garage. He was arrested. And during a transfer to Mont Valérien prison, he tried to escape. A bullet caught him in the thigh. Surgery could not save him. He died at Marmottan Hospital at the age of 22. For Doksun, there was no medal, no monument, no citation, only a photograph that the official history tried to forget. Here is where the official story collapses under its own weight. In the months after the liberation, while Paris celebrated its white saviors, the French army was systematically removing black soldiers from the front lines. General Joseph Magnan had requested as early as May 1944 that the 6th Regiment of African Riflemen be relieved. The request was initially rebuffed, but after Bedell Smith's memo, it became policy. By September 7, 1944, the General Staff was circulating orders for the rapid transformation of colonial units. Black soldiers who had fought across southern France were stripped of their weapons and sent to logistics duties or repatriated. White replacements, many with no combat experience, took their places. The assumption you have been taught that the liberation was a triumph of democracy over racism cannot survive this fact. The racism was not defeated, it was reorganized. It was photographed out of existence. As historian Olivier Vaviorka established, Allied High Command asserted that Parisians would be hostile to black fighters and felt only white faces could inspire confidence in the masses. The confidence they sought was not military, it was racial. It was the confidence of a white world that needed to believe it had saved itself. But Doksun was not the only erased participant. There is another name you need to remember. Adiba, born Mamadou Hadiba in French Guinea in 1916. He had traveled to France in 1933 and worked as a cook for a colonial administrator. When the war came, he enlisted in the 12th Regiment of Senegalese Tirailleurs. Taken prisoner in 1940, he escaped and organized the Maquis de Vosges, the first resistance group in eastern France. The Nazis called him Der Schwarze Terrorist. The milice hunted him. In November 1943, he was arrested, tortured, and executed at Epinal on December 18th. He was 27 years old. He never lived to see the liberation he had fought for. And if he had, he would have been barred from marching in it. We will connect Adiba's ghost to the modern legacy in Act 4. Remember his name. We return now to the document I promised you, the Bedell Smith memo of January 1944. I am going to read from it directly because you need to hear the voice of the bureaucracy that traded truth for racial order. The memo states, and I quote, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel. This would indicate the 2nd Armored Division, which with only 1/4 native personnel, is the only French division operationally available that could be made 100% white." It continues, British General Frederick Morgan wrote to Allied Supreme Command, "It is unfortunate that the only French formation that is 100% white is an armored division in Morocco. Every other French division is only about 40% white. I have told Colonel de Chevenny that his chances of getting what he wants will be vastly improved if he can produce a white infantry division." They knew the French army was 2/3 colonial. They knew there were not enough white soldiers to fill the ranks, and they ordered the whitening anyway. When the numbers did not add up, they imported Spanish Republicans and North Africans who could pass. They created a white division by subtraction and substitution. This is not speculation. This is not revisionism. This is a primary source produced by the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, confirmed by BBC Document Forensics in 2009, available in the archives today. The viewer is not watching a theory. You are watching evidence being unsealed. The memo was not alone. It was accompanied by operational orders that filtered down through the French General Staff. On September 7, 1944, the staff issued directives for the rapid transformation of Senegalese units. Colonial soldiers who had fought from Provence to Alsace were ordered to surrender their equipment to white replacements. In some units, the scenes were surreal. Decorated and wounded tirailleurs had to hand their weapons to barely trained white civilians. The stripping was literal. Uniforms were removed like names erased. Veterans of the 9th Colonial Infantry Division recalled bitterly, "That day, we were made invisible." The cover-up was not passive, it was active. American occupation authorities applied pressure through the winter of 1944, ensuring that black soldiers remained separated from white troops. French authorities monitored colonial veterans, censoring their communications and freezing their pensions. In 1959, the pensions of Senegalese tirailleurs were formally frozen. The French government did not apologize until 2002, and the most incriminating documents, including the full chain of orders from Bedell Smith to de Gaulle's desk, remain scattered across classified archives in Washington, London, and Vincennes. The cover-up is not history, it is a living archive. Which brings us to the living legacy. In late November 1944, around 1,300 former Senegalese servicemen gathered at the military camp of Thiaroye, near Dakar. They had returned from Europe to find their pay withheld, their benefits denied, and their dignity trampled. They protested. The French state, rather than listen, chose repression. During the night of November 30th to December 1st, 1944, French troops opened fire on the unarmed veterans. Dozens were massacred. Some survivors were jailed for 10 years. The exact death toll remains obscured by bureaucracy to this day. The logic that excused the whitening of Paris, that white victory outweighed black sacrifice, did not end in August 1944. It traveled to Senegal. It entered the barracks. It entered the rifles pointed at men who had worn the same uniform months earlier. We will expose the full lineage now. Connect the hidden angle to the present. The photograph of the liberation did not gather dust. It became the foundation of French national memory. For decades, school books showed only white faces on the Champs-Élysées. The Carnavalet Museum's Liberation exhibition contained no black faces. As one historian noted, an omission too precise to be accidental. The French Republic rebuilt itself on the myth of a white sovereign nation that had freed itself. The colonial empire, which had supplied the majority of the troops, had to be erased in form. This erasure served a political purpose. If black men had liberated Paris, how could the Republic maintain the indigenat system in Africa? If colonial soldiers were heroes, how could they be denied citizenship? The whitening was not cosmetic, it was constitutional. It preserved the racial order of the empire by denying the empire's own sacrifice. President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged in 2019 that African combatants for many decades did not receive the glory and esteem that their bravery justified. But acknowledgement is not compensation, and the pensions remain frozen in the archives of indifference. But the haunting is not only French. In the United States, the same racial order that produced Bedell Smith's memo was coming home. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, arrived in France in October 1944 and fought 183 consecutive days of combat. They liberated 30 towns. They rescued the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. They suffered 50% casualties. And when they returned home in 1946, there were no parades, no ticker tape, only renewed skepticism, disdain, and overt hostility. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who had refused evacuation despite a gruesome leg injury and fought until he was killed in Guibling, was denied the Medal of Honor until 1997. The same government that had demanded a white liberation in Paris was denying black veterans their dignity in Alabama. The precedent set in 1944 that black sacrifice was acceptable but black visibility was not, became institutionalized. It entered the GI Bill, which white veterans used to build suburbs while black veterans were denied mortgages. It entered the segregated cemeteries, where Rivers was buried 5,000 miles from his family in Oklahoma. The ethical corrosion did not stop at the water's edge. It came home. It entered the housing covenants. It entered the polling stations. It entered the bloodstream of American inequality. Do not look away from the tension. If the truth were accepted tomorrow, who would have to pay? The French government would owe an accounting not just to history, but to the descendants of the tirailleurs whose pensions were stolen. The American government would have to confront the fact that its own racial segregation shaped Allied military policy in Europe, and the myth that World War II was a crusade against racism would collapse. Because the Allies did not defeat racism, they managed it, they exported it, they photographed around it. The monuments that would have to come down are not made of stone. They are made of narrative. The belief that de Gaulle liberated Paris with the French division. The belief that the resistance was white. And the comforting lie that the war ended in 1945. It did not end, it was cropped, it was classified, and it is still hanging in the Carnavalet Museum. Now feel the click. The Bedell Smith memo authorized the theft of visibility. It said white personnel was more desirable. Georges Duxon, the erased participant who should have been honored as a liberator, was marched away at gunpoint and died in a prison hospital at 22. Adiba, the resistance fighter who never lived to see the liberation, was executed by the Nazis while the Allies were already planning to exclude him from the victory. And the modern consequence, the frozen pensions, the Thiaroye massacre, the all-white memory of liberation, and the delayed Medal of Honor for Reuben Rivers still operates on the precedent that black sacrifice is welcome but black presence is not. The document, the men, and the living institution are not separate stories. They are one continuous transaction. The memo ordered the erasure. The erasure enabled the myth. The myth justified the pensions. And the pensions bought the silence of generations. All locks open at once. The war you thought you knew was a different war entirely. Should France and the United States acknowledge the whitening of the liberation? Or is historical amnesia just the price of national unity? Next time, we will cover the Nazi economist who invented the modern global tax haven and how the architecture of offshore finance was built in a Berlin basement before it moved to London and Delaware.